Okay, so the title of my research study was Nectar Preferences of Neotropical Hummingbirds at the Institute for Tropical Ecology and Conservation. As you all know, I'm Tizoc, Zarate, and this was my first ever scientific research study, or research study at all for that matter. To begin, I'd like to explain the motivation behind this experiment, the why, which I've been told is actually the hardest type of question to answer when it comes to science. First, I believe this study would be a wonderful opportunity as someone visiting the neotropics for the first time. And that's because 97% of all hummingbird species live here in the neotropics. The second reason is that 10% of all hummingbird species are currently globally threatened, while 60% face declining populations, and that's mostly due to deforestation. Third, hummingbirds are an important pollinator species. In fact, 7,000 plant species rely on them. In a study published by the American Journal of Botany, it was said that, quote, "The ecological codependency between plants and hummingbirds is a classic example of mutualistic interaction," end quote. The fourth reason is that hummingbird feeders are an up-and-coming trend and hobby. I think this is a result of COVID-19, where the whole DIY, do-it-yourself household hobbies took off in order for people to keep busy and sane. I mean, if you simply search on YouTube, DIY hummingbird feeders, you'll see all kinds of results, most of which were uploaded within the last 3 years. Also, it's probably really rewarding to finally see a hummingbird come to your feeder. However, I wouldn't know because none came to mind. And lastly, I really love birds. And doing this research made me fall in love with a specific type of species, the hummingbirds. So, that brings us to our next topic, the background knowledge. So, hummingbirds belong to the biological family of Trochilidae. There are 360 species of hummingbirds around the world, 350 of which live here in the neotropics, which is that 97% I mentioned earlier. Here at iTech, we have 7. The green-breasted mango, the long-tailed hermit, the white-necked Jacobin, rufous-tailed hummingbird, the violet-crowned wood nymph, the bronzy hermit, and the purple-crowned fairy. Now, hummingbirds eat small insects, such as ants. They also eat pollen, which sticks to their beaks, sand for minerals and digestion, but most important of all, they eat nectar. And that's because they have such a high demand for it. The energy hummingbirds get from nectar is the reason that these little creatures are capable of moving around so fast. In fact, as opposed to simply flying, hummingbirds hover. Also, their fast metabolisms call for constant refueling. The slowest of the species has 10 wing flaps per second, while the fastest, 80 wing flaps per second. 80 wing flaps per second. Could you imagine? Not only that, but the longest some hummingbirds can fly is 26 and 24 hours non-stop in reference to males and females respectively. 24 hours, 26 hours. Hummingbirds also can go for 600 miles or more traveling during that 24 and 26 hour period. 600 or more miles. Wow. These birds have an affinity to certain types of plants. They love ones that are bright in color, particularly red, plants that are that have tubular-shaped flowers for their beaks and tongues, and of course, those rich in nectar. This description fits the plant type that my research revolved around perfectly, which is the Heliconia. As of now, there has yet to be a vast amount of research studies conducted on hummingbird behavior, or even in general for that matter, which comes as a surprise. Of course, that is not to say that you won't find any research out there, but substantial conclusions are hard to come by for the most part. The reason is because they are so quick. They're also very timid, and their fossils, when it comes to any morphological type studies are very fragile. Which brings me to my next slide, my 3 research questions, which are, what food source will the hummingbirds prefer? The heliconia nectar or the sugar water? Here I hypothesize that because of their strong evolutionary ties to the plant, they may prefer the nectar from the heliconia. My second research question was, of the 2 feeders, of the 2 feeder types that I created, which type will the hummingbirds be attracted to most? Here my hypothesis was that the tubular shape of the water stopper may draw hummingbirds to the water bottle feeders more so than the jam container feeders. And last but not least, will the hummingbirds prefer the low concentration or high concentration of sugar? Where I hypothesize that the hummingbirds may be drawn to the feeders with the higher sugar concentrations. But what were my methods, you might ask? Especially as a first-timer in this type of work. Well, I used 2 different sites. They were about 80 meters away from one another. One on the corner of this building here, just behind me, and the other, which was just outside of the laboratory, and that was my experimental site. For my experimental site, I made 4 total feeders and 2 different types of feeders. 2 of them were made out of old plastic water bottles, and the other 2 were made out of plastic jam containers. For the water bottles, I used the food stopper tube that the hummingbirds would feed from, which is right here. For the jam containers, I drilled 6 holes onto the tops of the containers so that the hummingbirds could stick their beaks in for feeding. As you can see, I also decorated the feeders with flowers, both types, and then for the water bottle feeders, I painted the bases of the water bottles green, just to come off as more plant-like. And then for suspending it into the air, which you can see right here, I used rope. And then the tree that I suspended these in the air at was called a Calliandra surinamensis, with a lowercase s, by the way. All right, one of each feeder type had a 4 parts water to 1 part sugar ratio. And this set was called Water Bottle 1 and JC1, Jam Container 1. I got this recipe from the Smithsonian Institute's website. The other set of feeders, which I called Jam Container 2 and Water Bottle 2, had double the amount of sugar. One way I intended on gathering data was via camera traps, and the other via observation. For my observational method, I spent 1 hour at each site for 5 days in a row. Here and there. I tracked every hummingbird that came to the site I was at. What time they visited, the amount of time that they visited, whether or not they fed at the site, then how long they fed for, and then their behavioral description. I use those recordings to fill out table 2 on a daily basis. So this is where I filled out how many came, their subject number and description of it, which allowed me to then identify the species type, the time that they came, within that 1 hour time frame that I was at each site, and then I used that to fill out table 2 here. Now, for a number of reasons, I was not able to obtain an adequate amount of data from the camera traps. This was mostly due to the technical difficulties, such as positioning of the cameras, forgetting to put the memory card in one night, and lack of captured activity. This table, however, was the one I had intentions of using during this phase of experimentation. Here are some of my results that I gathered from my hour-long observations at each site. during the course of those 5 days, of course. For graph 1, I compared the amount of seconds per day hummingbirds spent at the control site versus the experimental site. On graph 2 here, it's very similar, but instead of seconds per visit at each site, it compares the amount of seconds that the hummingbirds fed at each site per day. Results show that they spend more time visiting and feeding at the experimental site via the averages here. Now as we continue, graph 4 demonstrates that the number of visits each species had at the control site, graph 3, at the control site versus the experimental site, where graph 4 demonstrates the number of visits each site had in every 1 hour time frame between the hours of 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. So 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And those are the hours that I did my observation, depending on the time of day, because some days it was raining early in the morning, some days there was a lot of construction going on. I worked with what I had. Which brings me to the findings, or the discussion. Through my experimentation, I found that hummingbirds spent more time visiting and feeding at the experimental site. As graph 3 showed, the green-breasted mango and bronzy hermit were the most active within the areas of my sites. Right here and right here. And it's interesting because it's at opposite sites that these two are the most active at. And although there was no bronzy hermit visits at the experimental site, there was a lot of green-breasted mango ones at the control site, which I believe was due to, I guess, their tolerance for human activity. Per graph 4, you can see that between the hours of 11 and 2, there was hardly any activity at the control site, which is when construction went on. So I think that there was a little bit of correspondence there, a little bit of a pattern that we saw. Through my research, I also found that many scientists mention that there's a lack of studies done on hummingbirds, including but not limited to their behavior. I mentioned some of the reasons earlier, such as deforestation and their bones being so fragile, them being so timid. But I believe that although there are so many obstacles when it comes to researching hummingbirds, this shouldn't discourage people from trying. I think that instead, we just have to adapt our scientific methods like the hummingbirds adapted to be such marvelous and talented creatures. In regards to my hypotheses, all of my research questions remain inconclusive after this study. I do believe, however, that it's worth mentioning that I started off my observations at a very close distance. I was about 5 feet away from each site. And every day I started going farther and farther back, which is when I started seeing more activity from the hummingbirds. In addition, the third to last day is when the hummingbirds at the experimental site started to notice the feeders and look down at them. That day, one got as close as 12 feet away. The next day, the second to last day, one got within 8 feet of the feeders. And on the last day, one hummingbird, the green-breasted mango, got within 1 foot of my feeder, which excited the hell out of me. So some considerations to make for any future studies are as follows. The first is that it takes time. And what that refers to is the amount of time hummingbirds need to get used to a feeder and to begin using it as a food source. It can take days, weeks, and sometimes even years, depending on various factors, such as cleanliness, human activity, etc. Which brings us to our next consideration. Hummingbirds are very timid. They can also be territorial if brought to that level, and that is because they prefer to remain solitary. I could not use my data to find correlations, concrete patterns, or anything of that nature because there was no replication completed in regards to my experimentation, neither in my control site or my experimental site, for example. And an example of that would be having multiple control sites or different feeding sites. When it comes to my own research, some considerations to be made and reflected on would be the weather, as it rained a lot during the hours that the hummingbirds were most active, as well as the construction which took place at this building, which affected the amount of activity at my control site. Here go my works cited. And then also special thanks to some certain set of people and animals. Olivia, because Olivia got me into the sciences, told me about this class, and also just made me very passionate about learning again. All of y'all, because all of y'all helped me so much, not only stay sane, but learn so much about myself and about the environment and how to appreciate nature. My dog, Pepe Jones, who's back home and being very patient, waiting for Olivia and I. My family, I'd like to thank myself just for having enough courage and strength to continue on and be one of the only non-scientists here, you know, just trying my best. And then also I'd like to thank the hummingbirds, and then more than anything else, I'd like to thank Mother Earth.
Great job, Tizoc.
Thank you.